Trump's war on diversity, equity, and inclusion isn't just reshaping America, it's sending shockwaves across the border into Canada. And what we're seeing is a quiet corporate retreat that's happening in boardrooms from Toronto to Vancouver, with companies scrambling to distance themselves from programs they once proudly championed. A new study by a national law firm has just revealed the extent of this retreat, and the numbers are staggering. But here's what makes this story particularly explosive. Canadian companies aren't just following Trump's lead, they're anticipating it, quietly pulling back on DEI disclosures, even before being forced to do so. This isn't just corporate cowardice, it's a fundamental shift in how businesses operate in the shadow of Trump's America. Let's break down exactly what's happening and why this matters far beyond corporate boardrooms. The study found that fewer Canadian public companies are trumpeting their records on diversity, equity, and inclusion, though many are quietly pressing ahead with the initiatives despite the DEI backlash in the United States. This creates a fascinating paradox. Companies are continuing to do the work, but stopping the public celebration of it. It's corporate stealth mode, and it reveals just how far Trump's influence reaches. To understand how we got here, we need to rewind to 2020. Following the murder of George Floyd and the massive Black Lives Matter protests that swept across North America, corporate boardrooms experienced what can only be described as a DEI awakening. Companies rushed to make public commitments, hire chief diversity officers, and announce ambitious targets for representation. Between 2019 and 2022, chief diversity and inclusion officer roles grew over 160%. Pro-DEI shareholder activism rose dramatically, and companies were publicly committed to hiring employees from historically underrepresented groups, conducting racial and pay equity audits, and achieving greater transparency in hiring and promotions. It was a corporate movement that seemed unstoppable, but then the political winds shifted dramatically. The 2023 Supreme Court decision overturning affirmative action in universities marked a turning point. Conservative activists like Robbie Starbuck began launching pressure campaigns against companies, forcing household names like Deere and Company, Harley-Davidson, Molson Coors, and Walmart to scale back or eliminate their DEI policies. These weren't small companies making quiet adjustments, these were corporate giants publicly abandoning commitments they had championed just years earlier in the face of mounting pressure.
Thousands of people are expected to gather in more than 2,600 rallies across the U.S. today, taking part in the third No Kings protest. It is the latest mass mobilization since Donald Trump's return to the White House, and it is expected to be the largest, with thousands turning out against the president's strong use of his executive powers. Let's bring in CTV News U.S. political analyst Eric Ham. Eric, thanks very much for joining us. And I hope you can hear us all right, because I know you're on the ground at one of the protests right now. What's it like there?
Yeah, we're here in Washington, D.C. Actually, we're just across the street from the Canadian Embassy, and the stage is behind me. They're doing sound testing right now. This is going to get started around noon today. Already, you've got hundreds of protesters that are lining up in the streets right now. They're still setting up, but they're expecting thousands of people. Streets have been closed off everywhere. And of course, there's a very spirited audience of people here carrying signs saying "No Kings," protesting Donald Trump's immigration, ICE programs, and a bevy of other issues that right now their people are just simply dissatisfied with.
The scale of this reversal was unprecedented. What had been a source of corporate pride was suddenly becoming a liability, and the speed of the retreat was stunning. Then came Trump's return to power, and with it, a full-scale assault on DEI programs that went far beyond anything we'd seen before. On his first day in office, Trump signed executive orders dismantling DEI programs throughout the federal government. But he didn't stop there. The orders directed the Attorney General to identify private sector companies with what Trump called egregious and discriminatory DEI programs, signaling potential investigations of publicly traded corporations and large nonprofits. Trump made his position crystal clear during a remote address to executives at the World Economic Forum in Davos. My administration has taken action to abolish all discriminatory diversity, equity, and inclusion nonsense. And these are policies that were absolute nonsense throughout the government and the private sector. The message to corporate America was unmistakable. comply, or face consequences.
Well, again, this is another move that we're seeing by the administration. And the president has already spoken about this, openly admitting that these tariffs are making it more difficult for an economy that appears to be shrinking. And again, one of the reasons why you're seeing even some pushback from people within the president's own party is because they themselves are continuing to say that inflation and prices continue to rise. In fact, Roger, we just got some new polling data on Donald Trump's approval ratings, which show that right now he's way underwater. In fact, the only area where he's doing well right now is on the border. But some of the biggest issues that Republicans have done really well in, namely the economy and being able to tackle the inflation, right now we're seeing the president massively underwater. And again, these tariffs are certainly not going to help, both with his approval rating as well as with trying to garner support from the public to support these tariffs.
And the polling data showed that while Trump's approval ratings were underwater on economic issues, his hardline stance on these cultural issues was resonating with his base, giving him political cover to push even harder. The impact was immediate and dramatic across corporate America. Companies like Google, Amazon, Meta, and Goldman Sachs began rolling back their DEI policies. Google, which had cloud computing contracts with federal agencies, announced it would retire its aspirational hiring targets. The company's commitments for 2025 had included increasing the number of people from underrepresented groups in leadership by 30% and more than doubling the number of Black workers at non-senior levels. Those targets, gone overnight. Amazon's Candy Castleberry changed her vice president title from VP of Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion to VP of Inclusive Experiences and Technology. The work might be similar, but the messaging had to change. Even the language around DEI became toxic, forcing companies to rebrand their efforts entirely. But here's where the Canadian angle becomes particularly interesting. The spillover effect is happening even without direct government pressure. The study by the national law firm found that Canadian companies are voluntarily scaling back their DEI disclosures, largely out of concern over how U.S. regulators might react if they have cross-border operations. This isn't just about compliance, it's about corporate survival in an interconnected North American economy. Canadian securities regulators have actually been moving in the opposite direction, looking at broadening existing diversity disclosure requirements in response to calls for greater transparency from investors. There's also been growth in pay transparency legislation in Canada, reinforcing momentum toward equity-focused initiatives. But the political reality south of the border is forcing Canadian companies to walk a tightrope. Companies with operations in both countries face a particularly complex challenge. They must navigate Canadian requirements for diversity disclosure while avoiding scrutiny from Trump's administration. Some are choosing to comply with Canadian mandates but pulling back on voluntary disclosures that might attract unwanted attention from U.S. regulators. Bill Gilliland from Denton's law firm has reviewed public disclosures from major Canadian energy companies with U.S. operations. His findings are telling, comparing spring 2024 to spring 2025, there's been continued compliance with Canadian DEI disclosure mandates, but a noticeable pullback in voluntary DEI disclosures. Companies are doing the minimum required by Canadian law, but nothing more. The FCC has even threatened to block mergers and acquisitions from media companies that promote DEI policies. This unprecedented use of regulatory power to punish diversity programs has never been tried before, according to legal experts. It represents a fundamental shift in how government power can be wielded against corporate policies. But the retreat isn't universal, and that's where this story gets even more complex. Some companies are standing firm despite the pressure. JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon reaffirmed the bank's support of DEI, stating that the largest bank in the U.S. will continue its outreach to Black, Hispanic, LGBTQ+, veteran, and disabled communities. Costco's board unanimously opposed a proposal asking the company to report the risks of maintaining its DEI policies, stating that their commitment to an enterprise rooted in respect and inclusion is appropriate and necessary. Cosmetics company Lush put out 3 new bath bombs named Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, making their position unmistakably clear. These companies are betting that standing by their values will ultimately benefit their business, even in the face of political pressure. The data suggests they might be right. Recent studies show that DEI work remains popular among workers and companies. Pew Research found that 86% of workers have a neutral to favorable opinion about increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. Another study found that 73% of companies still include diversity, equity, and inclusion in their company values, on par with 2023 levels. The disconnect between political rhetoric and workplace reality is striking. But for Canadian companies, the calculation is particularly complex because they operate in a different legal and political environment. Canada's political landscape is generally less polarized than the United States, and the legal underpinnings of DEI programs are different. Canadian companies aren't facing the same direct government pressure as their American counterparts, but the economic integration between the two countries means they can't ignore U.S. political developments. The study's findings suggest that many Canadian companies are taking a wait-and-see approach. They're continuing their diversity work, but reducing public disclosures about it. Some are tying their diversity data more directly to business impact rather than broad social objectives, making the business case more explicit while downplaying the social justice aspects that have become politically controversial. This shift in messaging reflects a broader corporate strategy: maintain the substance while changing the presentation. Companies are finding ways to continue diversity work under different names and frameworks. What was once called DEI might now be described as inclusive experiences, belonging initiatives, or talent optimization programs. The work continues, but the branding changes. Legal experts are advising companies to audit their DEI programs under attorney-client privilege to assess potential risks while continuing to protect corporate values. The goal is to maintain programs that combat bias and promote inclusion while avoiding language and practices that might attract unwanted attention from U.S. regulators. The Canadian Securities Administrators have been wrestling with proposals on mandated board diversity disclosure for public companies, with two competing models emerging. The Ontario model is more prescriptive and lists specific diverse groups companies must include in their disclosure. The Western model, backed by Alberta and Saskatchewan, is more narrative and allows companies more freedom to define diversity as they see fit. This regulatory uncertainty adds another layer of complexity for companies trying to navigate the changing landscape. The broader implications extend beyond corporate boardrooms. The retreat from public DEI commitments could have significant effects on workplace culture and employee retention. Survey data shows that 53% of U.S. workers say DEI is a key factor when considering a new job, with that percentage rising to 63% among millennials and 77% among Generation Z. Companies that publicly abandon diversity commitments risk losing talent from these demographics. Similarly, 92% of global LGBTQ+ employees consider potential employers' reputations around LGBTQ+ inclusion when searching for a job. The business case for diversity remains strong even as the political environment becomes more hostile. The economic argument is compelling. A 2020 study estimated that the United States' aggregate economic output would have been $16 trillion higher since 2000 if racial gaps in wages, access to higher education, lending, and mortgage access had been closed. Companies with more inclusive policies show measurable business outcomes, including decreased employee turnover and higher revenue growth compared to competitors. But the political reality is forcing companies to balance these business benefits against regulatory and reputational risks. The Trump administration's approach represents a fundamental shift in how government power can be used to influence corporate behavior. By threatening federal investigations, regulatory action, and merger blocks, the administration is creating powerful incentives for companies to abandon diversity programs regardless of their business value. For Canadian companies, this creates a particularly challenging environment. They must balance their own business interests and values against the reality of operating in an integrated North American economy where U.S. political developments have far-reaching consequences. The study's findings suggest that many are choosing caution over conviction, maintaining diversity work while reducing public visibility. The long-term implications of this corporate retreat remain unclear. If companies can successfully maintain inclusive practices while avoiding political controversy, the substance of diversity work might continue even as the public conversation changes. But if the pressure leads to actual abandonment of diversity initiatives rather than just quieter implementation, the effects on workplace equity could be significant. What's clear is that Trump's war on DEI has succeeded in changing the corporate conversation around diversity, even in countries where he holds no direct political power. The study of Canadian companies reveals the extent to which U.S. and political developments now influence corporate behavior across borders, creating a new reality where businesses must navigate not just their own regulatory environment, but the political climate of their largest trading partner. This isn't just about diversity programs, it's about the reach of political power in an interconnected global economy. As Canadian companies continue to quietly adjust their approaches to diversity disclosure, they're writing a new chapter in corporate risk management, one where political considerations increasingly outweigh business benefits in shaping public corporate behavior. The Trump effect on Canadian corporate culture is just beginning, and the full implications of this quiet retreat from public diversity commitments won't be known for years to come.